I caught my husband cheating while holding our newborn. What happened next destroyed his life forever and then. The first time I held my daughter, it felt like everything else in the world faded out, the blinding fluorescent lights, the stiff smell of antiseptic, even the sharp ache in my lower back from 30 hours of labor. Just for a moment, there was only her, soft skin, tiny fingers, a little flutter of breath as she slept against my chest. Her name was Nora, and she was perfect. Outside the hospital window, Cleveland was blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, the trees bending under the weight of winter, and it looked so quiet it almost made me believe in peace. Derek stood beside my bed wearing a charcoal suit like he was headed to an investor meeting, not witnessing the first moments of his newborn daughter's life. That was always his thing, buttoned up, professional, a man who never let the tie loosen even when everyone else had given up for the day. He looked down at us with a kind of distant wonder, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, like a man who appreciated the idea of a family more than the mess of actually having one. "You did great, Leah," he whispered, blue eyes bright like he was proud, but also just ticking a box he'd trained himself to say. Before I could answer, a voice came from the doorway. "Mom, can I come in?" Toby poked his head around the door, his hair tousled under his knit hat, cheeks pink from the cold. I couldn't help but smile. He'd been counting the days to his little sister's arrival like it was Christmas morning. 12 years old, trying to act casual but glowing in that awkward middle school way that reminded me so much of his father it hurt sometimes. "Of course," I said, adjusting the blanket around Nora as Toby walked in. He moved carefully, like he knew babies might shatter if touched wrong, and sat on the edge of the bed with wide eyes. "She's so small," he whispered, holding her like a porcelain doll, gentle and awestruck. That was the moment it hit me. We were a family again, even if everything about how we got here was messy. 5 years ago, I left Toby's father, Eli, after a stretch of nights I still can't talk about without feeling sick. He'd been my college boyfriend, a soft-spoken guy who started as a gym teacher and worked his way up to athletic director at a fancy private school. The pressure of that job turned him into someone I couldn't recognize, nights filled with whiskey and slammed doors, weekends with bruised words I had to explain away to her son. One night, I found Toby hiding under his bed after Eli had come home yelling loud enough to shake the walls. That was it. I packed bags and walked out without a plan. I didn't even know if I'd survive on a teacher's salary with a kid to raise, but it was better than raising Toby in a house soaked in fear. To his credit, Eli didn't spiral. He got help. A rehab program, therapy, volunteer work at a recovery center. He's been sober for 4 years now and hasn't missed a single one of his scheduled visitations with Toby. 2 years ago, I met Derek during a school fundraiser where his daughter, Ella, had just joined my class. He'd lost his wife to an autoimmune disease a few years prior, and there was this quiet sadness around him that felt safe. He was respectful, generous, and stable in all the ways Eli never managed to be. He took me to expensive restaurants and never forgot a birthday. He offered support, emotional, financial, practical, and for once I let myself believe that I deserved something easy. When I got pregnant with Nora, it felt like we were finally on the same page about building a future. Derek said all the right things, that he was ready, that he wanted this, that our blended family would be something beautiful. Now, watching Toby hold his baby sister with a wonder I hadn't seen on his face since he was 5, I tried to believe it too. But something about the way Derek hovered just slightly out of reach made me pause. Like he was present but never quite in the moment. After the nurse checked my vitals, she handed me the discharge papers. "Your husband mentioned he has an appointment, but he'll take you home first." Derek nodded while glancing at his Rolex. "Big meeting with a firm that's ready to bundle their entire life insurance portfolio with us. I'll get you home, then shoot straight downtown." It shouldn't have stung, but it did. I gave a half smile and told him it was fine. My mom was flying in later that night, and Toby could help me settle in. As he left the room to grab the car, there was a knock at the door. "Mind if I come in?" Eli stood there with his usual beat-up coat, and that half smile he always used when unsure of the mood. The air shifted immediately. Derek hadn't liked Eli from the beginning, no matter how polite they pretended to be around each other. "Dad," Toby lit up and ran to hug him. "Look, it's my sister." Eli stepped in, eyes going soft as he looked at the baby. "Congratulations, Leah. She's beautiful." I nodded and thanked him, watching as he gently touched Nora's hand. Eli still had the look of an ex-athlete, but his edges had softened over the years. He now worked at a rehab center, mentoring others walking the path he'd managed to crawl through. "I'm taking Toby camping this weekend," he said, grinning at his son. "Got the tent and everything." Derek came back just then, his smile thin. "Time to get going." The nurses bringing the chair. Eli met my eyes one last time and said quietly, "If you ever need anything, you can always call me." There was something in his tone that felt heavier than usual, but I didn't ask. As the nurse wheeled me out with Nora in my arms, I saw Eli step aside while Derek adjusted his cufflinks and unlocked the car. Toby was riding with Eli. They planned to grab hot cocoa on the way. I didn't know then how soon that offer to help would become something far more literal, or that this quiet Cleveland morning, blanketed in snow, was the last moment of calm we'd get for a long time. All I knew was that I had 2 children now, a complicated past, and a future that no longer felt as certain as I once believed. 2 weeks after Nora was born, our townhouse looked like it had been ransacked by a very small, very cute tornado. The living room that used to hold my books and one well-placed plant was now an obstacle course of folded baby clothes, burp cloths, bottles, and squeaky stuffed animals that always seemed to go off at night when no one was touching them. I hadn't slept longer than 3 hours since we got back from the hospital, and I was running on caffeine, muscle memory, and some inner current of mother panic that never really quieted down. Toby had adapted better than I expected. He made it his personal mission to help out with everything: heating bottles, bouncing Nora when I needed a shower, even folding baby laundry in lumpy, clumsy stacks that I couldn't bring myself to fix. I kept telling him he didn't need to, that he should just be a kid, but something in him wanted to prove he could be useful. Maybe he thought I needed saving. Maybe he was right. One night, after feeding Nora and getting her back into the bassinet, I collapsed on the couch with a blanket and tried to force myself to rest. Derek wasn't home. He'd been leaving earlier and coming back later each day, with some excuse about overlapping campaigns and 3 simultaneous deals that couldn't wait. I'd heard the same phrases so often they sounded rehearsed. When he came in around 1 a.m., I pretended to be asleep. But I wasn't. I lay still, listening to the soft shuffle of his steps, the zip of his garment bag, the click of the bathroom door. When he slipped into bed beside me, I caught the faintest scent of perfume, floral, expensive, and definitely not mine. I said nothing, just stayed still, eyes closed, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a client. Maybe someone bumped into him at the elevator. Maybe. The next morning, I found a small card on his desk when I went to get the insurance binder he told me to grab. It wasn't hidden. Not really. Just there between papers. A woman's name, Jenna, written beside it. 8:30 p.m. at the Glenmont. I knew the Glenmont. A hotel that served champagne with room keys and cost more for a night than my paycheck in a week. I stared at the card for a long time. I didn't take it. I didn't say anything. I just put it back exactly where I found it and walked back out like I hadn't seen it at all. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was work-related. But I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to leave the hospital early with Nora. My nerves were raw, and the sterile white walls and distant sounds of other babies crying weren't helping my sense of sanity. I told the nurse I was ready to go. She hesitated, but I insisted. Derek hadn't answered my text in 2 days, and I couldn't explain why, but it felt urgent to leave. I called a cab, said I'd be fine getting home. I didn't tell anyone he wasn't picking me up. Didn't mention that my husband had vanished without a word since that perfume-soaked night. When the driver pulled up outside the building, I stepped out with Nora tucked tightly in her blanket and my travel bag slung over one arm. Snow crunched under my boots, and the cold bit at my fingers through my gloves. The building's entryway was quiet. I took the elevator to the 5th floor, exhausted but relieved to be back in my own space. As I stepped out into the hallway, something stopped me. On our apartment door was a note, paper torn hastily, taped crooked, ink smeared slightly by moisture. 4 words. Block letters. No signature. Do not enter. Call police. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to think it was a prank. But no one would joke like this. Not in a building like ours. The handwriting was rushed and urgent, not playful. My hands began to tremble. I looked down at Nora, still asleep against my chest, her tiny mouth forming soft sighs. I fumbled with my phone, gripping it with one shaking hand while trying to balance my daughter in the other. Dialed 911. The operator's calm voice grounded me just enough to give them the address and explain the situation. Stay outside, they told me. Wait for officers. Do not enter the residence. I backed away from the door and stood near the elevator, holding Nora close. My heart was pounding so loudly it muffled everything else. I kept staring at that note, half expecting someone to open the door and laugh, say it was a mistake. But no one came. 5 minutes later, I heard sirens. 2 officers came up in the elevator, a man in his 50s with a calm, weathered face and a younger woman with a steady presence. They introduced themselves quickly and asked if I had anywhere nearby I could go. The family across the hall, I said. The Millers. Apartment 503. They escorted me across, and Mrs. Miller welcomed us inside immediately, worry etched into her face. She offered tea, set down a warm blanket, and cooed at Nora with a trembling hand. I stood by the window, eyes fixed on the hallway where more officers were arriving. My stomach twisted with every passing minute. What the hell was going on in my home? 15 minutes passed. Then a knock on the door. One of the detectives stepped in. His expression was tight, unreadable. He asked if we could speak privately. I passed Nora to Mrs. Miller and stepped into the hallway. There's been an incident, he said. 2 people were found inside. A man and a woman. Both are injured. My legs felt like water. Was he Derek? I managed to ask. Yes. He's alive. Both of them are. But it's serious. They've been taken to St. Eliza's under emergency care. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I just stared at him, waiting for the part where any of this would make sense. We found a message written in blood, he added quietly, on the bathroom mirror. A young officer nearby, pale and shaking, turned away suddenly and leaned against the wall like he might pass out. It felt like a movie, a horror film I hadn't agreed to be in. I kept thinking about the note. That one simple piece of paper that kept me and Nora from walking into whatever hell was inside that apartment. Do you know who left it? I asked. He shook his head. Not yet, but it might have saved your life. Just then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A call. The name on the screen stopped my breath cold. Eli. Before I even answered, I knew. He knew something. He'd been there. When I picked up Eli's call, his voice was tight, shaking but controlled, like someone trying not to fall apart. He asked if I was okay, if Nora was safe, and when I said yes, he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. I asked if he left the note on my door, and after a long pause, he said yes. That one word carried the weight of everything I hadn't understood until now. He told me he'd come by to drop off groceries after picking up Toby from school, but when he got to the building, he saw someone else entering Jenna, the same woman from the card I'd found on Derek's desk. He followed her up without thinking, he said, and watched her unlock the door with a key. That stopped me cold. A key. She hadn't knocked or buzzed, she had access. He said something about the way she looked made his skin crawl. She didn't look happy or excited. She looked like someone about to confront a ghost. He didn't know why, but he waited outside the apartment. A few minutes passed, then there was a scream. Not just a loud noise or a yell. He said it sounded like pure panic, like someone trying to escape something that couldn't be outrun. He wanted to go inside, but he didn't know what was happening. He was afraid if he burst in, he'd make it worse. So he scribbled the warning, stuck it on the door, and ran back down to call the cops. He didn't know I'd be discharged early that day. He just had a bad feeling and couldn't ignore it. That bad feeling had saved my life. And my daughter's. Now I was sitting in the waiting room at St. Eliza's Hospital, holding Nora against my chest while she slept through the chaos she'd been born into. The antiseptic smell, flickering fluorescent lights, and the quiet buzz of vending machines were the only things grounding me to the moment. Toby sat next to me, knees pulled up to his chest, his face pale and still, trying to understand why the man he called Dad was upstairs under police supervision after being stabbed in our home. Eli walked in a few minutes later, holding 2 coffees and a hot chocolate. He handed Toby the cup without a word and sat beside me. I took the coffee with trembling hands, the warmth almost unbearable against my cold fingers. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. You were following him? He nodded. Not following. Watching. quietly. After everything you've been through, I wasn't going to let someone hurt you again. Something about him never sat right with me. His charm always felt practiced, like it was covering something else. I stared at him, unsure if I felt grateful or betrayed. I didn't even have the energy to untangle the difference. You hired someone? I did it myself, he admitted. I still have my PI license from before. Between that and my work at the clinic, I've picked up a few side cases. At first, I just checked his business records. Then I looked into his travel schedule. Then I found Jenna. That name again. It was starting to sound like a warning bell. She worked at his firm, Eli continued, voice low. They'd been involved for months. He'd promised her things, told her he loved her. She was pregnant. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. She told me 2 days ago, he said. She was scared. Said he wanted her to end it, that he got furious when she refused. He told her she'd regret it if she went through with it. I told her to go to the police, but she was too afraid. I closed my eyes, holding Nora tighter. My daughter and Jenna's baby were going to be born weeks apart, and Derek had been living a double life like it was nothing. He was trying to silence her, Eli said quietly. And I think when she showed up today, he lost control. A doctor appeared in the hallway, clipboard in hand, and called my name. I stood slowly, body heavy like I'd aged a decade in a day. Eli came with me. Your husband, Mr. Carter, is stable, she said, eyes scanning my face for any visible reaction. He sustained 2 stab wounds to the abdomen, but no vital organs were hit. He lost a lot of blood, but the surgical team controlled it in time. I nodded numbly. And the woman? Jenna Simmons is also in recovery. 1 chest wound, 1 head injury from blunt trauma, and she was pregnant. 11 weeks. We're still monitoring the fetus. My knees nearly gave out. Eli steadied me with a hand under my arm. I sat back down and stared at nothing for a long time. Minutes later, a detective entered the waiting room. Connor, I think his name was. Broad-shouldered, with a weary look that told me this wasn't his first disaster. He sat across from me and pulled out a small notebook. We've recovered Jenna's phone, he said. There are voice recordings and messages between her and Derek that are extremely concerning. Audio of him threatening her, pressuring her to terminate the pregnancy, even admitting that it would ruin everything if it became public. I wanted to throw up. There's more, he added. The knife recovered at the scene had Derek's fingerprints. The angle of entry and her injuries suggest she acted in self-defense. Witnesses, neighbors, say they heard him yelling first. And there was no forced entry. She used a key. Everything I had ignored for months was unraveling into a nightmare. The perfume, the long hours, the business trips, the exhaustion. All of it had been cover for lies he'd stacked so high even he couldn't keep them straight anymore. I want to speak to her, I said suddenly. To Jenna. The detective blinked. That might not be. I need to hear it, I said. From her. I need to know exactly who he was when he wasn't with me. Eli didn't say anything, but he placed his hand on mine and didn't let go. Because he knew I wasn't asking for closure. I was demanding the truth. Jenna agreed to see me 3 days after the incident, her voice barely audible when the nurse wheeled her into the visitor room at the hospital, 1 arm in a cast, a bruise spreading beneath her left eye, her skin pale against the hospital gown. She looked nothing like the person I'd imagined all this time, not the villain in my marriage, not some seductive coworker clawing her way through a scandal. She looked wrecked, like someone who hadn't known she'd wandered into a war zone until the first shot hit. I was holding Nora when I walked in, her soft breathing grounding me as I sat down across from Jenna. I'm not here to fight, I said before she could speak. I'm not here to blame you either. I just need the truth. Her eyes welled up immediately, and she nodded. I didn't even know about you until after I got pregnant, she whispered. He told me he was divorced. Said he was raising a son, that he'd lost his wife in a car accident years ago. He even showed me photos of you and Toby, said they were his late wife and her nephew. I blinked, stunned by how deep the lies went. I believed him because he was so good at it, she continued. He said he was afraid of being judged, that his last relationship ended badly and he needed time before introducing someone new into his life. I didn't question it. I was working under him and… She stopped, swallowed hard, and I let the silence stretch. I found out about you when I went to drop off some paperwork and saw a baby blanket in his car. I confronted him. That was 2 weeks ago. He told me to leave it alone. that he had everything under control. When I told him I was keeping the baby, he lost it. Nora stirred slightly in my arms, and I bounced her gently, but my stomach twisted tighter with each word Jenna spoke. He threatened me, she said. Said if I didn't do what he asked, he'd make sure I lost my job, ruin me financially, tell people I was unstable. He said I was ruining his family, that I was selfish and manipulative. She paused and looked at Nora. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you or your baby. I just wanted to protect mine. When she said that, something shifted inside me. I believed her, not because I wanted to, but because I had lived through that same fear. I'd lived with a man who turned love into a weapon, who twisted words into shackles, who made me question the reality right in front of my face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I truly am. I nodded slowly, holding Nora tighter. He fooled both of us. Maybe worse than we'll ever realize. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the nursery, rocking Nora back and forth, watching her eyelids flutter beneath the soft glow of the nightlight. Across the hallway, Derek's study sat untouched, and I knew I'd never walk into that room the same way again. Every detail, his favorite pen, the photo of us on the bookshelf, the perfectly aligned binders, was part of the illusion. The life we'd built was nothing but carefully arranged lies dressed up to look like security. The court hearings came fast. His lawyers tried to paint Jenna as unstable, claimed she had a history of inappropriate behavior at work, that she was obsessed, that she'd attacked him out of jealousy. But the evidence destroyed all of that. The recordings, the texts, the voicemail he left her 2 nights before the attack, threatening to handle it if she wouldn't. He was sentenced to 5 years. No suspended term. No appeal. The judge made it clear he was lucky not to face attempted murder charges. I didn't go to the sentencing. I watched the coverage from home while Nora slept on my chest and Toby read a book on the couch. Eli was in the kitchen fixing a leaky faucet like he had every right to be there, like this was the way life had always been. I looked around and realized the house finally felt like a home again. Not perfect, not quiet, but real. Jenna moved into the guest house we used to rent out. She didn't have anyone else nearby, and I wasn't going to let her face this alone. She was 5 months pregnant by then, and her recovery had been slow, but every day she looked a little stronger. She helped with dishes, folded laundry when she could, and sometimes just sat next to me while we listened to the babies breathe. It wasn't a traditional friendship. It wasn't built on laughter or shared hobbies. It was built on surviving the same storm. Toby built a crib for her baby with Eli's help, sanding the edges until they were smooth, painting the wood in soft colors. This one's for her, he said proudly one afternoon, gesturing toward the small guest house window where Jenna sat watching us. I hugged him tighter than I probably should have. Eli and I never defined what was happening between us. We didn't need to. He was present, dependable, and soft in all the ways I remembered from when we first met. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He simply showed up. And that was enough. Our backyard became the center of this strange, healing universe. Margaret, Eli's mother, came by on weekends with pizza and cinnamon bread. Betsy, our eccentric neighbor, dropped off handmade toys and stories about the war. For the first time in years, I felt surrounded by people who didn't demand a version of me. I could be tired. I could be messy. I could be angry. And they stayed. One Sunday, we were all out on the deck, sun setting behind the maple trees, the smell of grilled vegetables in the air, and laughter rising from the table. Jenna was smiling, her hand resting on her belly. Eli poured iced tea. Toby chased a giggling Nora around the yard. And I stood still, watching, memorizing, knowing I didn't need to hold on too tightly. Because this wasn't borrowed happiness. This wasn't something I'd have to earn. It was mine. Summer arrived like a slow exhale, the kind that makes you think maybe you've finally come out the other side of something. The air was warm, and the trees out front had finally filled out again, casting long shadows across the front walk, where Nora toddled unsteadily behind Toby, who had taken to playing the role of overprotective big brother with almost military seriousness. Inside the house, Jenna moved slower now, her due date just weeks away, but she smiled more, laughed easier, and every time I saw her rub her belly absently while talking to the baby inside, I felt something like hope. Our days had settled into a rhythm. Unpredictable, chaotic, but familiar in the way only survival makes things feel solid. The guest house had become a second home, and Jenna, whether she knew it or not, had become part of the family. Not out of pity, not because I felt responsible, but because she belonged here in a way that made sense without explanation. We had both been through hell, both trusted the wrong man, both survived with scars we didn't know anyone justification for. Eli came by often, sometimes for no reason at all. One Saturday morning he showed up with paint cans and said, "Thought I'd fix the porch, the railing's loose." I didn't ask why he suddenly cared about the porch. I just made coffee and sat nearby while he worked, Nora asleep on my chest and Toby drawing on the back of an old pizza box. One afternoon, I got a message from an old friend, someone who hadn't reached out since before the trial. She said she'd seen Derek's name in a local paper. Apparently he'd applied for early release, citing mental stress and diminished capacity. I read the article 3 times before closing the browser. I didn't forward it to Jenna. I didn't tell Eli. I didn't want to give the past any more oxygen. The man we both knew was never coming back here. Not through those gates, not into our lives, not again. But that wasn't entirely true. Because one evening, not long after that, I saw the parked car. It was across the street, just far enough to avoid suspicion, just angled enough that I couldn't see the driver clearly. But I knew. Some things you just feel. He was watching the house, watching us laugh in the backyard, watching the people he thought he'd manipulated into place go on living without him. I didn't say anything to anyone that night. I didn't call the cops. I didn't text Eli. I just stood at the window with Nora on my hip and stared back until the car drove away. I know what I saw, and I know what he lost. A week later, Jenna went into labor. It was fast, more intense than expected, and I drove her to the hospital myself while Eli stayed with the kids. The contractions came like a storm, wave after wave, and by the time we arrived, she was already fully dilated. 2 hours later, she was holding a baby boy in her arms, her eyes so full of tears I could barely see her through mine. She named him Micah, and he had her chin and Derek's hair, but that didn't matter. He was hers. Ours in a strange way. A second chance made flesh. She stayed at the hospital for 2 days, and when she came home, we had the crib ready, balloons in the kitchen, and a freezer stocked with food. Toby made a welcome home sign with glitter glue that got everywhere, and Nora tried to feed Micah a stuffed giraffe, which I chose to believe was her version of generosity. We took a photo that night, me, Jenna, Eli, Toby, Nora, and Micah. No titles, no traditional roles, just a group of people standing in a kitchen under the hum of soft lights, holding babies and plates of reheated lasagna, laughing like we'd never known a single bad day. The photo sits on the mantel now. People ask sometimes, mostly strangers or acquaintances, how I could let her stay, how I could live side by side with the woman my husband cheated with. I don't explain it anymore. She didn't destroy my family. He did. She helped save what was left of it. Eli and I still haven't labeled what we are. He doesn't sleep over, but he never really leaves either. Some nights we just sit on the porch after the kids go down, sharing tea and stories we've told 100 times, because even repetition feels like safety when it's earned. He's patient in a way he wasn't before. I'm softer in ways I never thought I could be again. Last week, I found a letter in the mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single folded page, Derek's handwriting, unmistakable even after a year. He apologized. Said he never meant to hurt anyone, that he'd been scared, overwhelmed, panicked by the idea of becoming a father again. Said prison had been humbling, that therapy was helping, that maybe one day he could be part of Nora's life. I didn't respond. I folded the letter in half and put it in the drawer under the sink with the expired coupons and old batteries. He lost the right to ask for anything. Nora took her first steps last night, wobbled from the couch to my arms while Toby clapped and Jenna cried and Eli caught it on video. She looked so proud, like she'd conquered gravity itself, like she knew exactly where she was supposed to be. So did I. Because this is the life I built from nothing but broken pieces. This is the family no one expected, not even me. And for the first time in a long time, I don't need to run. I'm already home.